Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Eddington, starring Joaquin Phoenix, Pedro Pascal, Luke Grimes, Deirdre O'Connell, Michael Ward, Austin Butler, and Emma Stone, directed by Ari Aster. Now, before I get into this review, welcome back to Ari Aster. After I did his filmography leading up to Beau is Afraid a few years back. But am I looking forward to returning to this? But is this the movie that should have been led up to? I don't know, but I have seen it twice, and let's see how this goes. The movie takes place in Eddington, New Mexico in the month of May in the year 2020. While the madness called COVID-19 is happening, people have to wear masks as a mandate as a homeless man talks to himself and he enters Eddington, while the sheriff of town, Joe Cross, played by Joaquin Phoenix, doesn't wear one. And right off the bat, the character comes off very unlikable, as he doesn't wear a mask because he has asthma, which I get, but it's not a very good reason if you don't want to die like none of us do. And I really wish I didn't talk about this in a movie, but Lord knows director Ari Aster is going to make me because I reviewed his previous movies. And I'm going to do my hardest to not talk about my opinion on politics, because that's nobody's damn business to hear anything about my opinion of it, as I'm here to talk about my opinion of a movie. As this wasn't supposed to take place in COVID-19, but because it happened, Ari Aster added it to the script as part of the plot, and it pisses me off just like this fucking movie does, from the start all the way to the finish. As Eric Garcia and Brian walk by and Joe gets to a bar to stop the same homeless man from getting in a bar that the mayor of town from that's owned by Eric's father, Ted Garcia, played by Pedro Pascal, telling him he doesn't have a mask on, so he can't come in. And Joe doesn't do shit about it. And the homeless man comes in and Joe gets aggressive with him. People hate the fact he doesn't have a fucking mask on. As Eric films the whole thing and puts it on Instagram later in the movie, as he gets home with flowers for his wife Louise, played by Emma Stone, as he lives with her mother Dawn, played by Deirdre O'Connell. And if I'm being honest with myself, as people for some reason like this movie, I don't like the characters, as they're just assholes to begin with. Joe wakes up with Louise and Dawn arguing with one another as they have breakfast together, and he gets to the grocery store and sees Fred without a mask, as Joe tells the grocery store manager to let him shop inside without a mask, as Joe does it as well. And people look at the both of them, and Fred gets kicked out again as by the grocery store manager, Tony, and he almost kicks out Joe, and Ted sees him and talks to him about policy, while people film him acting out without a mask and buys Fred's groceries, and he gives them to Fred. And this is making me realize I don't like this movie, as the plot is a mess. And I'll explain why later in the film. Joe makes an announcement about how he's running for mayor because he's led to believe there's no COVID-19, which, that's bullshit. I went through it a few times, and that's not a reason to run for mayor of Eddington, while giving the homeless man a water bottle as he walks in to get some ideas to run for mayor. And with his deputies, Michael, played by Michael Ward, whom I reviewed in Sam Mendes' Empire of Light, and Guy, played by Luke Grimes, whom I reviewed twice in Antoine Fuqua's The Magnificent Seven remake, and Clint Eastwood's American Sniper. While Ted talks with Joe outside while he records the conversation with his cell phone and compares himself to Ted as a better human being than Ted is, as Ted hears the government, as Paula comes off like a bitch to him, and he signs a paper as Ted went out with Louise 20 years earlier, while Eric goes out with Ted's car, and he comes off like a punk ass to not only his father but Joe, as well as film a campaign commercial. And the cinematography in this was, I guess, fine, but Pedro Pascal's having a year, as he's got that new Fantastic Four movie that I'm going to review next time. And as for the Avengers retrospective after Ironheart, and he's been in other movies like Gladiator 2, and he's all over the place now. It's so funny. Joe watches the campaign video, and they try to come up with a campaign video of their own, and afterhand he goes to Paula's restaurant with Michael to chat with her as Eric gets drunk and flirts with a young girl named Sarah while acting weird about it. And the actress who plays Sarah, I have reviewed her before in The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, unfortunately, because I didn't like that film. As he gets to know her while she dated Michael at one point, as he became a cop, while Michael helps Joe out with the sign. As he gets home and Luis sees the video of his announcement for being mayor, while he looks up a video by Vernon, played by Austin Butler, whom the audience will meet later in the movie. And I like him as an actor, but this character comes off unlikable, as well as him and Emma Stone. But I'm disappointed in them for doing this movie to begin with. Luis gets home with Dawn very upset with Joe about the decision of Joe running for mayor, and he asks to talk with her over dinner, as she reluctantly agrees, while Dawn interrupts them a couple of times. And we move on to Joe announcing his part on being mayor, while Eric rides by as he says his father dumped his whore of a wife, as they encounter some protesters about Black Lives Matter because of the news about George Floyd's death, which is something I remember to this day, while Michael is against the protesters, as he should be with them, and they see it on the TV, and Brian gets called retarded, which is a word I don't like to use in general, because Black Lives Matter, as white people protest against white supremacy, and people were laughing at some of this and on my second viewing, and somehow, in my opinion, it's not funny, as this is a mess of a movie, like I said before. Joe waits for Louise as she and Dawn get to their house with Vernon and Will and his wife Nicolette, and sit down to talk with Joe and Louise. And Vernon admires the art Louise made, and Vernon brings up something about how he was abused as a child, and he brings up how her father was sentimental and evil, as that upsets Louise, and she lets some steam out, while Dawn tells her that's enough of it, and eventually walks away, while I get the impression Louise really likes Vernon. And the acting in this scene, as well as this entire movie, was just, fucking painful, until Vernon, Will, and Nicolette leave the house, as Joe gets jealous and they get to sleep together, and he asks her something about her father as well as Ted while she's asleep, and the plot goes all over the place. That's the reason why this movie's a mess, as I don't know what the fuck this movie's supposed to be about, as we get the first half with Joe versus Ted campaign. Then we move on to the Black Lives Matter situation after George Floyd was killed. I just don't get this movie at all, as this is such a mess. Joe wakes up and hears protesters all over the streets of Eddington, and he gets to the office and get to the protesters as they fight with Joe, Guy, and Michael, and they fight with the protesting power, while Eric is there. And what would Ted think of this, as they're not standing 6 feet apart while filming Joe, and the others film Joe, as they get down on their knees, and the leader of the protesters, until Joe and Guy leaves to go to Paula's restaurant to make a speech, which was painful to listen to, like Ted as a raper, for example, while Michael stays behind. And at this point, and this is painful to watch, but in my opinion, it's better than Beau is Afraid, but it doesn't make this a good movie, in my opinion. After the speech, the protesters walk and chant to shut down the police, while Brian gets a photo of Eric kissing Sarah, as Michael gets it as well, while Joe gets home and Louise leaves him and never comes back, and gets picked up by Vernon. And we learn later on that Louise never asked for a divorce and just leaves him with her mother. Her mother. I'm sorry, I can't think. When, what the fuck, as she never shows up except for TV footage at the end of the film, as she never asks for him to sign some motherfucking divorce papers, as she blocks Dawn and Joe from calling, contacting, and messaging her ever again, as he watches a video with Louise in it until Guy calls getting a noise complaint about Ted's fundraiser being too loud, as Joe turns off the song Firework by Katy Perry, but Ted puts the music back on loud mode, And Joe does absolutely nothing about the noise complaint as Ted slaps him in the face twice after he demands him turning off the music, and people stare because he doesn't have a goddamn mask on. And these scenes were troubling, and it just took too long, as this is a long movie at 2 hours and 28 minutes, as I felt every single minute of it on both of my viewings. Joe comes to Ted's bar and sees the homeless man drinking a shit ton of alcohol as he gets drunk, and suddenly Joe shoots him dead. And again, I was like, what the fuck? As I was asking myself quietly in the theater, what the fuck is this? As he covers his own mess and takes the body to the lake, and all of a sudden shoots Ted and Eric from a distance while inside their house, as Ted and Eric asks Eric to not bring people in the house. And thank God Eric got killed, because that motherfucker deserved it, because he was getting on my nerves as he drives away from the crime scene and calls Louise, but she never picks up and goes far away from Eddington. And at this point, I just don't care for what's happening as well as the characters, and like I said, they come off like assholes. Guy calls Joe and talks to him about the murder of Ted and Eric Garcia as they meet Officer Jimenez Butterfly, played by an actor whom I reviewed a couple of times in the MCU in Echo and in Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, named William Below. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Please forgive me, sir. And Joe tells Butterfly to get out of his crime scene, as Joe comes off very disrespectful to Butterfly as he solves the crime, and Joe goes straight to Sarah and tells them they're dead in front of her mother, as her purse was there. And Joe announces himself as mayor of Eddington and tells the protesters speak twice, and tells them to own guns, as this guy is an idiot right off the fucking bat. As we get someone on the plane smoking, and what was the point of that scene while Joe watches videos of the protesters as well as the wedding video of him and Louise? And why is this movie still going, as I'm not checked out of this movie, but I wanted to just fucking end. Joe gets to town and into his office and gets Butterfly who happens to be there, as is Brian, who wants to talk to Joe about Eric, and Sarah as a couple as he leaves the room to get his phone and brings Guy in the interrogation room. And they let him go, and while they frame Michael for the murder of Ted and Eric. But first they interrogate him and find Eric's dead body was in his car and arrest his ass for murder, while Michael doesn't trust Guy, and Butterfly happens to be there. And this reminds me of some of the racist shit the cops can get sometimes. And Michael, which is very unfair, I'll say. And Michael calls his uncle, telling him he's been arrested, to bail him out, as Michael will leave the jail cell later in the film. And it just makes me sad to look at this movie. Butterfly sees Joe's plan to become mayor, while Joe follows Butterfly to a place where he's going to tell someone he believes Joe killed Ted, and Eric, as Guy interrupts along with Joe listening to Butterfly's conversation with Dawn, as Guy calls Joe and hears about the trash can on fire, and he jumps by at nighttime with Michael leaving the jail cell, and he drives out with an asthma attack and sees a sign that says white supremacy. And this movie being is this movie being racist for dummies? And they find Michael all taped up being held hostage by a fucking drone until he blows up, as the explosion was nothing too spectacular, and the fire writes as no peace, and Joe tries to shoot the drone down as it belongs to a bad guy as they escape to try to kill Joe. But none of this shit is making any sense, as I want this to just fucking stop, for Christ's sakes. We see Michael is barely alive as his eyes are still open, and we get back to the house to Joe finding Dawn, as he finds Dawn and confesses he killed Ted as Dawn is getting shot at. And I wish she was dead at this point, as the shooter strikes at the house and the taxi cab driver is dead, while we get to the town shootout, and he runs, and eventually Joe gets a machine gun against the killers, and we see Butterfly getting killed by the assassins in the head after Joe accidentally gets his leg, as Joe almost dies because he's out of his asthma pills, and one of the assassins almost kills Joe in the head with a fucking knife until Brian comes in and saves Joe's life by killing the assassin, as this should have killed him. And there's just no fucking way. I thought this motherfucker was dead, as that was pissing me off. Like, it's saying he made it alive in the most bullshit way possible, and because it's very unrealistic. Joe is hospitalized and becomes crippled, and we get to the point of view of Brian as he gets arrested, and 1 year later comes and people honor Joe as mayor at a company called Solid Gold Magikarp. And Magikarp, isn't that the name of a Pokemon or something like that? I couldn't tell you. Well, Michael films on him on stage, and this is a private event, which is someone tells him as there's no recording allowed. And he gets home, which is where I believe Ted lived in when he was alive, as he gets a haircut and sees Vernon and Louise on the computer as she dyed her hair while watching an old movie on the TV while getting taken care of. And it's sad Louise left him for another man as Joe sleeps with Dawn, and who happens to live in the house with them. And honestly, I thought Michael was going to shoot Joe dead, but instead he takes target practice as he can prepare to kill Joe. And rumor has it there's going to be a sequel after this fucking movie, which I hope not for so many reasons. I'll explain in the rating at the end. And the climax made this movie better than Beau Was Afraid, but doesn't make it a good movie, but by how much? Let's get to the rating and find out. I'll give this movie a 3.3 out of 10. Better than Beau Was Afraid in my opinion, but the character Joaquin Phoenix plays comes off very unlikable right off the bat, as this movie fucking pissed me off from the start all the way to the finish. And director Ari Aster added the COVID-19 later after finishing the script, and because it happened, I preferred without the COVID-19 stuff happening as part of the plot. And I don't like the characters as they come off like assholes. The plot goes absolutely nowhere, as the first half was about the campaign between Joe and Ted, and the second half lost me to the point it makes me not like the movie by the second half, which was all about the cops versus Black Lives Matter. And the final half was about Joe getting away with murder, as he was briefly dead. And he becomes crippled, and the cinematography was, I guess, fine, as some people like this movie while I didn't. The editing makes this movie too long, as this is a very long movie at 2 hours and 28 minutes. As director Ari Aster has this obnoxious habit of making his movies longer than they need to be. And it's a mess of a movie, as this is a non-recommendation for this movie, as the acting in this entire movie was fucking painful. As I don't get the plot of the movie, as I just don't get this movie, as it's absolutely just fucking painful to watch from start to finish. So I'd like to thank you guys for returning with me to Ari Aster, and until he makes another film, don't get scared.